Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. Whether you're lying in bed scrolling through your phone at 2 a.m, taking a break from work, or just looking for something that won't assault your brain with flashy graphics and screaming thumbnails, you've found the right place. This is where we dive deep into the stories that shaped our world, told slowly, thoughtfully, and without the noise. If you appreciate this kind of calm, research-based storytelling, where we actually respect your intelligence, consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps more people discover these longer form explorations, and it tells the algorithm that maybe, just maybe, there's still room for content that doesn't treat your attention span like a goldfish. Tonight, we're embarking on one of the most extraordinary journeys in human history. Not a journey measured in miles, but in courage, not recorded in any history book, because there were no books yet. This is the story of the first humans who looked across an impossible stretch of ocean and decided to cross it anyway. The story of how our species reached Australia and the vast blue barrier they had to overcome to get there. But before we dive into that crossing, we need to understand what they were crossing to, because the Australia these ancient voyagers reached wasn't the Australia we know today. It was something far stranger, far larger, and completely untouched by human hands. Picture this. It's roughly 65,000 years ago. The world is locked in an ice age, and vast amounts of Earth's water are frozen in massive polar ice sheets. Sea levels are more than 100 meters lower than they are today. Entire continental shelves that are now underwater lie exposed to the air, creating landscapes that no modern human has ever seen. In this frozen world, what we call Australia today was part of something much bigger. It was connected to New Guinea and Tasmania in a single massive landmass that geologists call Sahul. This wasn't just Australia plus a few islands. This was a continent spanning nearly 10 million square kilometres, larger than modern Europe, stretching from the tropical north to the temperate south, encompassing mountain ranges, river systems, and ecosystems that have since vanished beneath the waves. Imagine standing on the northern edge of this ancient continent. Instead of looking out at the Arafura Sea, you'd see vast plains stretching toward the horizon. Rivers would flow across landscapes that are now ocean floor, and in the distance, the highlands of what we now call Papua New Guinea would rise from these plains like familiar hills, easily walkable, no ocean crossing required. To the south, you could travel from the mainland to Tasmania, through grasslands and forests that exist only in the geological record now. The Bass Strait, that stretch of notoriously rough water that separates Tasmania from the mainland today, was just another river valley you could walk across. But here's the crucial point. Even with all these land connections, even with sea levels at their lowest, Sahul was never connected to the rest of the world. It was always an island continent, always separated from Southeast Asia by deep ocean trenches that never disappeared, not even during the most extreme ice age conditions. This barrier has a name, the Wallace Line, named after the naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, who first recognised it as one of the most significant biogeographical boundaries on Earth. West of this line, you find the animals of Asia, tigers, elephants, monkeys. East of it, the fauna is completely different. Marsupials, monotremes, creatures that evolved in isolation for millions of years. The Wallace Line isn't just a line on a map. It's a line drawn by physics, by the deep ocean trenches that separate the Asian continental shelf from the Australian one. Even when ice ages dropped sea levels to their absolute minimum, these trenches remained filled with water. The gap between the closest Asian islands and the edge of Sahul was never less than 70 kilometres of open ocean. In most places it was much more. This means that every single human who reached Sahul had to cross deep water to get there. There was no land bridge, no shallow ford, no way to arrive by accident. The journey required boats, planning, and a kind of courage that's difficult for us to imagine today. But what makes this crossing even more remarkable is what they were crossing to, because Sahul wasn't just isolated by water. It had been isolated for so long that it had become a world unto itself, populated by creatures unlike anything else on Earth. For more than 2 million years, while human ancestors were evolving and spreading across Africa and Asia, Australia remained completely empty of hominins. Not just empty of modern humans, but empty of any upright walking primates at all. While Homo erectus was thriving in Java, just across the water, not one of our ancient relatives ever made it to the Australian continent. This is one of the most puzzling facts in human evolution. Homo erectus lived in Southeast Asia for over 1 million years. They were successful, adaptable, and spread across a huge range of environments. Yet despite being so close, despite being capable toolmakers, and possibly even occasional seafarers, they never crossed that final water barrier to reach Sahul. The result was a continent that had evolved without any knowledge of what an upright, tool-using primate could do. The animals of ancient Australia had never been hunted by anything like a human. They had never learned to fear the sight of a bipedal figure on the horizon, never developed the wariness that comes from co-evolving with clever, social predators. Instead, they had evolved into forms that seem almost mythical to us now. Giant kangaroos stood over 2 meters tall. Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, was the size of a small car and browsed peacefully through woodlands. Massive, flightless birds called genyornis roamed the plains, some standing 2 meters at the shoulder. There were marsupial lions with retractable claws and bone-crushing jaws. Giant monitor lizards that may have reached 5 meters in length. Enormous, flightless birds with powerful legs that could deliver kicks capable of shattering bones. And ruling over much of this strange fauna were the megafauna, the giants that had grown large in a world without human predators. This was the world that awaited the first human voyagers. Not an empty wilderness, but a fully functioning ecosystem, populated by creatures that had never encountered anything like them. It was a world that had been running its own evolutionary experiment for millions of years, completely separate from the rest of the planet. But those first humans were still tens of thousands of years in the future. First, we need to understand the journey that brought them to the edge of that impossible ocean crossing, because by the time humans were ready to attempt the crossing to Sahul, they had already spread across most of the inhabited world. The story begins in Africa, where our species first evolved around 300,000 years ago. But the humans who would eventually reach Australia weren't the first to leave Africa. There had been earlier attempts, earlier expansions that reached as far as the Middle East and parts of Asia, but these early ventures had failed to establish lasting populations outside Africa. The successful expansion, the one that would eventually populate the entire world, began around 70,000 years ago. Small groups of modern humans began moving along the southern coasts of Asia, following shorelines, exploiting marine resources, and gradually spreading eastward. This wasn't a single great migration. It was more like a slow diffusion, groups splitting off and settling new areas, populations growing and spreading, generation after generation pushing a little further into unknown territory. Some groups stayed near the coasts, others moved inland, but the overall pattern was eastward, always eastward. By 65,000 years ago, these expanding populations had reached Southeast Asia. They were living in the complex archipelago of islands that we now call Indonesia, adapting to tropical climates, learning to navigate between islands, developing the skills that would eventually make the crossing to Sahul possible. But they weren't alone in this region. Southeast Asia was already inhabited by other human species. The descendants of much earlier migrations were still there, populations we now call Denisovans, mysterious relatives of both Neanderthals and modern humans, who had been living in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. When modern humans arrived in Southeast Asia, they didn't simply replace these earlier populations. They met them, interacted with them, and in some cases, interbred with them. We know this because the genetic signatures of these ancient encounters are still visible in the DNA of people living in the region today. This mixing of populations wasn't just biological, it may have been cultural as well. The Denisovans had been living in tropical Asia for far longer than modern humans. They knew the islands, the seasons, the resources. They had developed technologies and knowledge systems adapted to life in this complex maritime environment. When modern humans encountered these populations, they may have learned from them. Techniques for navigating between islands, methods for building watercraft, knowledge of currents and seasonal weather patterns. The skills that would eventually make the crossing to Sahel possible may have been developed through this cultural exchange. But even with this knowledge, even with the accumulated wisdom of populations that had been island hopping for hundreds of thousands of years, the crossing to Sahel remained a formidable challenge. It wasn't just a matter of building a boat and hoping for the best. It required planning, coordination, and a level of abstract thinking that pushed the boundaries of what we consider possible for humans of that era. They had to imagine a destination they couldn't see. From the highest points on the closest Asian islands, the coast of Sahel was beyond the horizon. There was no clear view of where they were going, no obvious landmark to aim for. Yet somehow they knew it was there. How did they know? Perhaps they saw birds flying in consistent directions, following migration routes that suggested land beyond the visible horizon. Perhaps they noticed clouds forming in patterns that indicated land masses they couldn't see. Perhaps floating debris, seeds, or other materials washing ashore hinted at forests and rivers somewhere to the south. Or perhaps they simply had the kind of restless curiosity that has always driven human exploration. The need to know what lies beyond the next ridge, beyond the next island, beyond the edge of the known world. Whatever motivated them sometime around 65,000 years ago, a group of humans made the decision to attempt the crossing. They built boats capable of carrying families and supplies across open ocean. They waited for favourable weather and seasonal currents, and then they launched into the unknown, heading south toward a continent no human had ever seen. We don't know how many attempts were made. We don't know how many boats were lost to storms or currents or simple miscalculation. But we know that at least some of them made it, because their descendants are still there. The successful crossing to Sahel represents one of the great achievements in human history. It was the first time our species had deliberately crossed such a large body of open water. It required technology, planning, and cooperation on a scale that challenges our assumptions about what early humans were capable of. But perhaps most remarkably, it was just the beginning, because once humans reached the shores of Sahel, they faced an even greater challenge, learning to live in a world unlike anywhere else on Earth, populated by creatures that had never seen anything like them. That story, the story of how humans adapted to life on an isolated continent, how they spread across landscapes that ranged from tropical rainforests to frozen mountains to burning deserts, and how they developed one of the world's oldest continuous cultures, is what we'll explore in the next part of this journey. For now, we leave our ancient voyagers on the threshold of discovery, their boats approaching a coastline that would change both them and the continent forever. The crossing was complete. The real adventure was about to begin. The first humans to reach the shores of Sahel didn't arrive as conquerors or colonizers. They arrived as survivors of an impossible journey, carrying with them only what could fit in their boats: stone tools, fire-making materials, and the accumulated knowledge of generations who had learned to read the sea. What they found waiting for them was a continent that had been running its own evolutionary experiment for millions of years. The animals that greeted them on these ancient beaches had never learned to fear the sound of human voices or the sight of upright figures moving purposefully across the landscape. This was a world where the normal rules of predator and prey had been written by creatures that existed nowhere else on Earth. The giants of Sahel weren't just large versions of familiar animals. They were something entirely different. Diprotodon, the massive browsing marsupial, moved through the woodlands like a living boulder, weighing over 2 tons and standing nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. These weren't aggressive beasts, but they were so large that they probably paid little attention to the small bipedal creatures that had suddenly appeared in their world. More concerning were the predators. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, was built like a nightmare fusion of a lion and a giant koala. It had retractable claws, massive jaw muscles, and specialized teeth designed for slicing through bone and flesh. Unlike the big cats of Africa or Asia, which these early humans might have encountered before, Thylacoleo was something completely alien, a predator that had evolved its own unique approach to killing. The skies above Sahel were dominated by genyornis, flightless birds that stood 2 meters tall and possessed powerful legs capable of delivering devastating kicks. These weren't the kind of birds that would flee at the first sign of human activity. They had evolved in a world without human hunters, and they had no instinctive fear of these strange new arrivals. But perhaps the most alien aspect of this new world wasn't the individual animals, but the entire ecosystem. In Africa and Asia, the early humans would have understood the basic relationships between predators and prey, the seasonal patterns of migration, the locations where water could be found during dry periods. Here, everything was different. The very concept of seasons worked differently. Instead of the familiar patterns of winter and summer, or wet and dry seasons, they might have known in tropical Asia, Sahel operated on its own climatic rhythms. The monsoons came from different directions, bringing rain to different regions at different times. The plants flowered and fruited according to schedules that had been established over millions of years of isolation. Even more challenging was the simple fact that many of the most important resources were completely unfamiliar. The edible plants bore no resemblance to anything these early humans had encountered before. Fruits that looked safe might be toxic, roots that appeared nutritious might require special processing to be edible, seeds that seemed promising might need to be ground, soaked, or heated in specific ways to unlock their nutritional value. This wasn't just a matter of trial and error. With small founding populations, every mistake could be catastrophic. If too many people became sick from eating the wrong plants, or if hunting strategies that had worked elsewhere proved ineffective against Sahel's unique fauna, entire groups could disappear without a trace. Yet somehow, these early arrivals not only survived, but thrived. Within a relatively short period after their arrival, archaeological evidence suggests they had spread across the entire continent. From the tropical north to the temperate south, from the humid east coast to the arid interior, humans had established themselves in every major ecosystem Sahel had to offer. This rapid expansion suggests something remarkable about these early Australians. They weren't just adapting to one new environment, they were simultaneously adapting to dozens of different environments, each with its own challenges, its own resources, and its own unique collection of plants and animals. In the tropical north, they learned to navigate dense rainforests and extensive wetlands. They developed techniques for hunting in environments where visibility was limited and where the sounds of their approach could be detected from great distances. They learned which trees provided edible fruits, which vines could be used for rope, and which leaves could serve as medicines. As they moved south into more temperate regions, they encountered entirely different challenges. The seasons became more pronounced, requiring new strategies for food storage and shelter construction. The animals were different, the plants were different. Even the stone available for toolmaking was different. In the arid interior, they faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all, learning to survive in landscapes where water was scarce and often unpredictable. They developed techniques for finding hidden water sources, for reading the subtle signs that indicated the presence of underground streams or seasonal pools. They learned to navigate by stars across vast open spaces where landmarks were few and far between. But perhaps most remarkably, they did all of this while maintaining their essential humanity. They didn't become isolated hermits, scattered across the continent in tiny struggling groups. Instead, they maintained social connections across vast distances, developed complex systems of trade and communication, and began the long process of turning this alien landscape into home. We know this because of what they left behind, not just the stone tools and fire hearths that mark their presence, but the evidence of something more sophisticated: the deliberate use of ochre, a red iron oxide pigment that had to be collected from specific locations, processed, and then applied to objects or surfaces for purposes that went beyond mere utility. Ochre use appears in some of the earliest archaeological sites in Australia, suggesting that these people weren't just concerned with survival. They were creating meaning, developing systems of symbolic expression, maintaining cultural practices that connected them to both their past and their new environment. The presence of ochre is significant because it represents something that separates humans from all other animals: the ability to create meaning through the manipulation of materials. When early Australians ground ochre into powder and mixed it with water or fat to create paint, they were engaging in behaviour that was fundamentally abstract, fundamentally human. They were also doing something else. They were beginning the long process of turning Sahel into Australia, because a continent isn't just a landmass. It's a relationship between people and place, an ongoing conversation between human culture and natural environment that shapes both over time. The early Australians didn't just adapt to their new home, they began to actively modify it. One of their most powerful tools was fire. Controlled burning had been a human technique for hundreds of thousands of years, but in Sahel it took on new significance. The continent's plants and animals had evolved in response to natural fire cycles, but they had never encountered the systematic, intentional use of fire as a landscape management tool. Early Australians began using fire to clear undergrowth, promote the growth of useful plants, create habitats that would attract game animals, and maintain travel corridors across otherwise impenetrable terrain. This wasn't random burning. It was sophisticated ecological management that required deep understanding of how different plants and animals responded to fire, how weather patterns affected the spread of flames, and how timing could be used to achieve specific outcomes. The effects of this fire management were profound. Over time, it helped shape the very character of Australian ecosystems, favouring fire-adapted species and creating the distinctive landscapes that would define the continent for tens of thousands of years to come. But fire wasn't the only tool these early Australians used to modify their environment. They also became gardeners of a sort, not in the sense of planting crops in neat rows, but in the sense of encouraging useful plants and discouraging harmful ones. They learned to protect productive areas, to selectively harvest in ways that promoted regeneration, and to transport seeds and cuttings to establish new populations of useful species in different locations. This kind of environmental management required not just technical knowledge, but social organisation, decisions about when and where to burn, which areas to protect, and how to coordinate activities across large territories couldn't be made by individuals. They required groups that could plan together, share information, and maintain agreements across generations. The archaeological evidence suggests that early Australians developed these social systems remarkably quickly. Within a few thousand years of their arrival, we see evidence of long-distance trade networks, standardised tool technologies, and shared symbolic systems that extended across vast areas of the continent. This rapid development of complex social organisation makes sense when we consider the challenges they faced. Small isolated groups might have survived for a while in some of the more hospitable parts of Sahel, but the successful colonisation of the entire continent required cooperation, information sharing, and collective decision-making on a scale that pushed the boundaries of human social evolution. They were writing the playbook for how to be human in a completely new kind of world, and they were doing it in real time with no opportunity for mistakes and no examples to follow. The fact that they succeeded, that they not only survived but created one of the world's longest continuous cultures, represents one of the greatest achievements in human history. Yet for all their success, these early Australians remain largely mysterious to us. We can trace their movements through the archaeological record, analyse their tools and techniques, even extract fragments of their DNA from ancient remains. But we can't hear their voices, can't access their thoughts, can't fully understand how they made sense of the extraordinary journey that brought them to this isolated continent. What we do know is that they were us, not primitive versions of modern humans, not some intermediate step in human evolution, but people with the same cognitive abilities, the same emotional complexity, the same capacity for love, fear, wonder, and creativity that defines our species today. They looked up at the same stars we see, felt the same basic human needs for food, shelter, companionship, and meaning. But they had to figure out how to meet those needs in a world that no human had ever encountered before, using only the knowledge they carried with them and whatever they could learn through direct experience. In many ways, their situation was more challenging than anything humans had faced before, or have faced since. Modern pioneers at least have maps, communication systems, and the accumulated knowledge of previous explorers. Early Australians had none of that. They were truly on their own, making it up as they went along, with the survival of their entire lineage depending on getting it right. The fact that they did get it right, that their descendants not only survived but flourished, tells us something important about human adaptability and resilience. It suggests that our species possesses capabilities that we're only beginning to understand, that the combination of intelligence, creativity, and social cooperation that defines humanity is even more powerful than we usually imagine. But it also reminds us of something else, that the story of human expansion across the globe wasn't just a series of triumphant conquests. It was a series of desperate gambles, impossible journeys, and acts of courage that we can barely comprehend today. The early Australians weren't heroes in the modern sense. They were survivors, doing whatever it took to build a future for their children in a world that had never seen anything like them before. Their success in adapting to this alien continent becomes even more remarkable when we consider what they were working with. These weren't people armed with metal tools, domesticated animals, or written knowledge passed down through generations. They carried with them only what could fit in their boats, carefully crafted stone implements, the knowledge of fire-making, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, who had learned to survive by reading the subtle signs of the natural world. The tools they brought were sophisticated in their simplicity, stone axes with ground edges that could fell trees and shape wood with precision that wouldn't be matched in other parts of the world for tens of thousands of years. Spear points hafted with plant resins that created composite tools stronger than either component alone. Grinding stones for processing seeds and roots, turning inedible plants into nutritious food through patient, methodical work. But tools were only part of the equation. More important was their knowledge of how to use fire not just for warmth and cooking, but as a technology for reshaping entire landscapes. They understood that fire could be a creative force, not just a destructive one. They knew how to burn selectively, how to create fire breaks, how to time their burns to achieve specific ecological outcomes. This fire technology became their most powerful tool for making Sahel habitable. The continent's ecosystems had evolved with natural fire cycles, but they had never experienced the systematic, intentional use of fire as a landscape management system. Early Australians began using controlled burns to clear undergrowth, promote the growth of edible plants, create grasslands that would attract grazing animals, and maintain travel corridors through otherwise impenetrable forests. The effects were transformative. Over time, their fire management helped create the distinctive, open woodlands and grasslands that would characterise much of the Australian landscape. They weren't just adapting to the environment, they were actively creating the environment they wanted to live in. But this kind of landscape management required something beyond individual skill or knowledge. It demanded social organisation, on a scale that challenges our assumptions about early human societies. Decisions about when and where to burn, which areas to protect, and how to coordinate activities across vast territories couldn't be made by single families or small groups. They required communities that could plan together, share information, and maintain agreements across generations. The archaeological evidence suggests they developed these social systems with remarkable speed. Within just a few thousand years of their arrival, we see signs of long-distance trade networks stretching across the continent. Ochre from specific quarries appears in sites hundreds of kilometres away. Stone tools made from distinctive raw materials are found far from their sources. Shell ornaments from coastal areas turn up in inland sites. This wasn't just occasional contact between neighbouring groups. This was systematic, sustained interaction across vast distances, suggesting networks of relationships that connected communities from the tropical north to the temperate south. They were creating not just survival strategies, but social technologies that allowed them to maintain connections across a continent. These networks served multiple purposes. They allowed for the exchange of resources, spreading rare or valuable materials to communities that couldn't access them locally. They facilitated the sharing of knowledge, ensuring that innovations developed in one region could spread to others. And perhaps most importantly, they maintained genetic diversity, preventing the kind of inbreeding that could have doomed small, isolated populations. But the most remarkable aspect of these early Australian societies wasn't their tools, or their trade networks, or even their fire management systems. It was their development of what we might call cognitive technologies, ways of organising and transmitting knowledge that allowed them to accumulate and preserve information across generations without writing. They developed sophisticated systems of oral tradition that could preserve accurate information for thousands of years. Stories that encoded practical knowledge about seasonal patterns, resource locations, and navigation routes. Songs that served as maps, preserving the locations of water sources, safe campsites, and dangerous areas across territories spanning hundreds of kilometres. These weren't just entertainment or cultural practices. They were survival technologies, ways of storing and transmitting the accumulated wisdom of generations in forms that could be memorised, shared, and passed down without degradation. A single song might contain information about seasonal weather patterns, the behaviour of specific animals, the locations of edible plants, and the proper protocols for interacting with neighbouring groups. The development of these oral knowledge systems represents one of the great intellectual achievements of early humanity. They created libraries without books, universities without buildings, maps without paper, all stored in human memory, all transmitted through human voice, all preserved through the simple but profound act of one generation teaching the next. This knowledge wasn't just practical, it was also deeply spiritual. Early Australians developed complex belief systems that connected them to the landscape in ways that went far beyond simple resource extraction. They saw themselves not as separate from the natural world, but as part of it, with responsibilities and obligations that extended to all living things. These spiritual systems weren't abstract philosophies divorced from daily life. They were practical frameworks that guided decision-making about everything from hunting and gathering to fire management and social relationships. They provided ethical guidelines for how to interact with the environment sustainably, ensuring that resources would be available for future generations. The sophistication of these early Australian cultures becomes even more apparent when we consider their artistic achievements. Some of the world's oldest rock art is found in Australia, dating back at least 40,000 years and possibly much earlier. These aren't crude sketches or simple representations. They're sophisticated artistic works that demonstrate advanced understanding of perspective, proportion, and symbolic representation. The rock art sites weren't just galleries, they were libraries, recording systems that preserved information about animals, plants, seasonal patterns, and cultural practices. Each painting was part of a larger narrative, a visual story that connected past, present, and future in ways that purely oral traditions couldn't achieve. Some of the most remarkable examples show what's called X-ray art, depicting animals with their internal organs visible. This wasn't just artistic creativity, it demonstrated detailed anatomical knowledge that could only have come from careful observation and systematic study. These early Australians weren't just artists, they were scientists, developing detailed understanding of the natural world through direct observation and experimentation. They were also innovators in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Recent archaeological discoveries have revealed evidence of sophisticated technologies that predate similar developments in other parts of the world by thousands of years. Ground edge axes that demonstrate advanced understanding of stoneworking techniques, composite tools that show knowledge of adhesives and hafting methods, processing techniques that could extract nutrition from plants that would otherwise be inedible. But perhaps their greatest innovation was something less tangible. They developed sustainable ways of living that could be maintained for tens of thousands of years without degrading the environment that supported them. They created societies that were complex enough to support large populations across a vast continent, yet flexible enough to adapt to changing conditions without collapse. This sustainability wasn't accidental. It was the result of conscious choices, cultural practices, and belief systems that prioritized long-term stability over short-term gain. They developed what we might call ecological wisdom, deep understanding of how human activities affected natural systems, and practical knowledge of how to live within environmental limits without exceeding them. The early Australians created something unprecedented in human history, a continental civilization that lasted for tens of thousands of years, without exhausting its resource base, without triggering ecological collapse, without destroying the very environment that made it possible. They proved that humans could live as part of natural systems rather than in opposition to them. Yet despite these remarkable achievements, early Australians remain largely invisible in most accounts of human history. Their technologies don't survive in museums, their cities were never built, their writing systems never existed. The evidence of their success is written in the landscape itself, in the ecosystems they helped create and maintain, in the cultural traditions that survived for millennia without institutional support. They succeeded not by conquering their environment, but by learning to work with it, not by accumulating material wealth, but by developing sustainable ways of meeting human needs, not by building monuments to individual achievement, but by creating cultural systems that could preserve and transmit knowledge across countless generations. Their story challenges our assumptions about progress, success, and human achievement. It suggests that the trajectory of human development doesn't always lead toward greater complexity, larger populations, or more intensive resource use. Sometimes the most sophisticated response to environmental challenges is learning to live more simply, more sustainably, more in harmony with natural systems. The first Australians didn't just survive their impossible journey across the ocean to an unknown continent. They created something that may be unique in human history, a way of being human that could last for tens of thousands of years without destroying the world that made it possible. In an age when our own civilization faces unprecedented environmental challenges, their example offers both inspiration and instruction about what sustainable human societies might look like. But their story is far from over. The descendants of those first ocean-crossing voyagers are still there, still maintaining connections to country that stretch back through hundreds of generations. They've survived ice ages, sea level changes, and more recently, the devastating impacts of colonization. Yet the cultural traditions, the knowledge systems, and the spiritual connections that sustained their ancestors for tens of thousands of years continue to this day. In our next segment, we'll explore how these early Australians spread across their new continent, how they adapted to everything from tropical rainforests to frozen mountains to burning deserts, and how they developed some of the world's most sophisticated systems for living sustainably in challenging environments. We'll discover that their success wasn't just about surviving in a new world, but about creating new ways of being human that we're only beginning to understand today. The story of how humans spread across this ancient continent reveals something profound about our species' capacity for adaptation. Within just a few thousand years of their arrival, these early Australians had established themselves in virtually every corner of Sahel, from the steamy tropical north to the windswept southern coasts, from the humid eastern forests to the stark red deserts of the interior. This wasn't a slow, cautious expansion over tens of thousands of years. This was rapid, purposeful colonization that suggests these people possessed not just courage, but sophisticated planning abilities and social organization that we're only beginning to appreciate. Consider what this achievement actually meant. They were moving into environments that no human had ever encountered before, with no guidebook, no previous examples to follow, no accumulated wisdom about what worked and what didn't. Every ecosystem they entered presented unique challenges that required new solutions. In the tropical north, they encountered dense rainforests where visibility was limited and the canopy filtered out most direct sunlight. The humidity was oppressive, making fire starting difficult and food preservation challenging. Many of the most nutritious plants were hidden high in the forest canopy, accessible only to those who developed techniques for climbing or for bringing the fruits down to ground level. The animals here were unlike anything they might have encountered in Southeast Asia. Tree kangaroos that moved through the branches with surprising agility. Cassowaries, massive flightless birds with powerful legs and sharp claws that could disembowel a human with a single kick. Crocodiles that grew to enormous sizes in rivers that seemed peaceful until you got too close to the water's edge. Yet archaeological evidence suggests they not only survived in these environments, but thrived. They developed specialized hunting techniques for forest animals, learned to process toxic plants to make them edible, and created tools specifically designed for working in dense vegetation. Moving south, they encountered completely different challenges. The seasonal variations became more pronounced, requiring new strategies for food storage and long-term planning. Winters brought cold that their tropical adapted bodies had never experienced. The plants were different, the animals were different, even the patterns of rainfall and drought followed unfamiliar cycles. But perhaps the most challenging environment they faced was the arid interior. These vast red deserts, stretching for hundreds of kilometres in every direction, presented survival challenges that pushed human adaptability to its limits. Water was scarce and unpredictable. Temperatures could soar during the day and plummet at night. Food sources were scattered and seasonal. Yet even here, they found ways to thrive. They developed techniques for finding hidden water sources, reading subtle signs in the landscape that indicated underground streams or seasonal pools. They learned to navigate by stars across vast open spaces where landmarks were few and far between. They discovered which desert plants could provide emergency nutrition and which animals could be hunted sustainably without depleting local populations. The speed of this continental expansion suggests something remarkable about early Australian social organisation. This wasn't just individual families wandering randomly across the landscape. This was coordinated, systematic exploration and settlement that required communication, planning and resource sharing on a massive scale. They developed what we might call exploration protocols. Groups would split off from established settlements, carrying with them not just tools and supplies, but knowledge about what to look for in new environments. They knew how to identify promising areas for settlement, how to test new food sources safely, how to establish camps that could serve as bases for further exploration. More importantly, they maintained connections back to their parent communities. When they discovered new resources or developed new techniques, that information flowed back through their networks. When they encountered problems or faced challenges they couldn't solve alone, they could call on the accumulated knowledge of the entire expanding population. This information sharing wasn't casual or haphazard. They developed systematic ways of encoding and transmitting knowledge that ensured crucial survival information wouldn't be lost. Some of this knowledge was embedded in stories that served as both entertainment and instruction. Some was preserved in songs that functioned as navigational aids and resource maps. Some was encoded in ritual practices that reinforced important behavioural patterns. The result was a continental knowledge system that allowed isolated groups to benefit from discoveries made hundreds of kilometres away. A technique for processing a particular plant developed in the tropical north could be transmitted to groups in the temperate south, adapted for local conditions, and then passed on to desert communities where similar plants might be found. This knowledge sharing had another crucial benefit. It prevented the kind of cultural drift that could have led to the development of incompatible societies. Despite spreading across a continent and adapting to radically different environments, early Australians maintained enough cultural coherence that they could continue to interact, trade, and intermarry across vast distances. Archaeological evidence for this cultural continuity appears in the form of shared tool technologies, similar artistic styles, and common symbolic systems that appear across the continent. A particular way of shaping stone tools developed in one region appears in sites thousands of kilometres away. Artistic motifs found in northern Australia show up in southern rock art sites. Ochre from specific quarries appears in archaeological sites across multiple climate zones. But maintaining this cultural coherence across such vast distances required more than just occasional contact. It required what anthropologists call active networking, systematic efforts to maintain relationships and share information across space and time. They developed what we might recognise as the world's first continental communication system, not based on technology in the modern sense, but on human relationships, shared obligations, and systematic information exchange. Groups would send envoys to distant communities, not just to trade goods, but to share news, exchange knowledge, and maintain social connections. These envoys carried more than just information. They carried genetic diversity, preventing the inbreeding that could have doomed small isolated populations. They carried cultural innovations, ensuring that useful discoveries spread throughout the network, and they carried social cohesion, maintaining the bonds that kept this vast continental society from fragmenting into incompatible groups. The sophistication of this early Australian society becomes even more apparent when we consider how they managed resources across such diverse environments. They couldn't simply apply the same strategies everywhere. What worked in the tropical north might be disastrous in the arid interior. What was sustainable in coastal areas might quickly exhaust resources in desert regions. Instead, they developed what we might call adaptive management systems, flexible approaches that could be modified based on local conditions while maintaining overall coherence. They understood that different environments had different carrying capacities, different seasonal patterns, different vulnerability thresholds. In resource-rich areas like coastal regions or fertile river valleys, they could support larger populations and more complex social organisations. In marginal areas like deserts or mountain ranges, they maintained smaller, more mobile groups that moved frequently to avoid over-exploiting local resources. But they also understood that these different regions were connected. Resources that were abundant in one area might be scarce in another. Groups that were thriving in good times might need assistance during droughts or other environmental challenges. They developed sophisticated systems for moving resources, people, and information between regions as conditions changed. This wasn't just practical resource management, it was also deeply spiritual. Early Australians developed belief systems that emphasised human responsibility for maintaining the health of natural systems. They saw themselves not as separate from the environment, but as part of it, with obligations that extended to all living things. These spiritual frameworks weren't abstract philosophies, they were practical guidelines that influenced every aspect of daily life. They determined when and where hunting was appropriate, how much of a resource could be harvested without damaging its long-term productivity, what obligations people had to share resources with others, and how human activities should be coordinated to minimise environmental impact. The result was a form of environmental management that modern ecologists are only beginning to understand. They created what we might call continental ecosystem management, coordinated human activities across vast areas to maintain the health and productivity of natural systems while supporting human populations. One of their most powerful tools was fire, but not fire as destruction. Fire as creation, as a technology for actively shaping environments to make them more productive and more suitable for human habitation. They developed sophisticated burning regimes that could promote the growth of useful plants, create habitats that attracted game animals, maintain travel corridors, and prevent the build-up of fuel loads that could lead to catastrophic wildfires. But this fire management required incredible coordination and knowledge. Decisions about when and where to burn had to take into account weather patterns, plant growth cycles, animal breeding seasons, and the activities of neighbouring groups. A poorly timed burn could destroy resources that other communities depended on, or create hazards that affected people living far from the burn site. They developed protocols for fire management that involved consultation across multiple communities, careful timing to minimise negative impacts, and ongoing monitoring to assess the results of burning activities. This wasn't just environmental management, it was continental planning on a scale that challenges our assumptions about what non-state societies could achieve. The success of these early Australian societies in managing such complex systems suggests they possessed cognitive abilities and social technologies that we don't fully understand even today. They were solving coordination problems that modern societies struggle with, using only human relationships and oral communication systems. They created sustainable systems that lasted not for decades or centuries, but for tens of thousands of years. They supported populations that were large enough to maintain genetic diversity and cultural complexity, yet small enough to avoid over-exploiting their resource base. They developed technologies that were sophisticated enough to allow them to thrive in challenging environments, yet simple enough to be maintained without institutional support. Perhaps most remarkably, they did all of this while maintaining cultural practices that emphasized sharing, cooperation, and collective responsibility rather than individual accumulation and competitive advantage. They created societies that were successful by almost any measure, yet operated according to principles that are radically different from those that drive modern industrial civilization. Their achievement becomes even more impressive when we consider the timeline. Archaeological evidence suggests that this continental colonization and the development of sophisticated management systems happened within just a few thousand years of their arrival. This wasn't gradual cultural evolution over tens of thousands of years. This was rapid social innovation under pressure, the development of entirely new ways of being human in response to unprecedented challenges. They were essentially conducting one of the largest social experiments in human history, testing whether human societies could successfully adapt to continental scale environmental diversity while maintaining cultural coherence and ecological sustainability. The fact that they succeeded, that their descendants maintained these systems for tens of thousands of years, suggests that they discovered something fundamental about how human societies can organise themselves to thrive within natural limits. Yet despite these remarkable achievements, early Australians remain largely absent from most discussions of human social evolution and cultural innovation. Their technologies don't preserve well in the archaeological record. Their social systems left no written documents. Their cities were never built because they didn't need cities. Their empires never existed because they found better ways to organise large-scale societies. They succeeded not by conquering their environment, but by learning to work with it. Not by accumulating material wealth, but by developing sustainable ways of meeting human needs. Not by building hierarchical institutions, but by creating networks of mutual obligation and shared responsibility. Their story suggests that the trajectory of human development doesn't always lead toward greater complexity, larger institutions, or more intensive resource use. Sometimes the most sophisticated response to environmental challenges is learning to live more simply, more sustainably, more in harmony with natural systems. But their story also reminds us that sustainability doesn't mean stagnation. These early Australian societies were dynamic, innovative, and constantly adapting to changing conditions. They developed new technologies, created new artistic forms, and evolved new social practices throughout their long history. They proved that human societies can be both stable and creative, both traditional and innovative, both locally adapted and continentally connected. They created something that may be unique in human history, a way of organising society that could last for tens of thousands of years without destroying the environmental systems that made it possible. In our next segment, we'll explore the evidence for these remarkable early Australian achievements, looking at the archaeological sites, genetic studies, and cultural traditions that reveal the sophistication of these ancient societies. We'll discover that the more we learn about these early Australians, the more we realise that they may have developed some of the most advanced social technologies in human history, technologies that we're only beginning to understand and appreciate today. Human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievements. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The first humans who reached Australia and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievements, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. And the ocean they had to cross. Human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia. and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement, the first humans who reached Australia, and the ocean. They had to cross human achievement. The evidence for these remarkable early Australian achievements comes from sources that most people never get to see. Ancient DNA extracted from bones buried in lake beds, microscopic traces of ochre ground into powder tens of thousands of years ago, and stone tools so precisely crafted that modern experts struggle to replicate them. But perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from something that's still alive today: the genetic signatures carried in the cells of Aboriginal Australians, which tell a story of continuous occupation stretching back to those first ocean crossings. When geneticists first began analysing the DNA of Aboriginal Australian populations, they expected to find the usual pattern seen in most parts of the world. Multiple waves of migration, genetic mixing from different source populations, and the complex layering that comes from thousands of years of demographic change. Instead, they found something unprecedented. The genetic data showed that Aboriginal Australians descend from a single founding population that arrived sometime between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, and then remained largely isolated from the rest of the world until very recent times. This wasn't just unusual, it was virtually unique among human populations. But even more remarkable was what happened after that initial arrival. Rather than remaining a single, homogeneous population, the genetic data showed that these early Australians began diversifying almost immediately. Within just a few thousand years of their arrival, distinct genetic lineages were emerging in different parts of the continent. This early diversification tells us something crucial about how these people organised themselves. They weren't wandering randomly across the landscape as individual families or small groups. They were establishing distinct regional populations, each adapted to specific environments, yet maintaining enough contact to prevent the kind of genetic isolation that would have led to inbreeding. The genetic evidence also reveals something else. These early Australians carried with them traces of DNA from other human species, specifically the mysterious Denisovans. This archaic DNA makes up about 3–5% of the modern Aboriginal Australian genome, much higher than in most other populations worldwide. This Denisovan ancestry isn't just scientific curiosity. It may have provided crucial adaptive advantages that helped early Australians survive in their new environment. Some of the Denisovan genes that persist in Aboriginal Australian populations are involved in immune function, metabolism, and responses to environmental stress. They may have been part of what made the successful colonisation of such a challenging continent possible. But genetics only tells part of the story. The archaeological record provides evidence of the sophisticated technologies and social systems these early Australians developed, and some of the most important evidence comes from the most unlikely places: ancient garbage dumps. Shell middens, the accumulated remains of countless meals, of oysters, mussels, and other marine life, might not seem like exciting archaeological sites, but they're actually treasure troves of information about how early Australians lived, what they ate, and how their societies were organised. These middens don't just tell us about diet, they reveal seasonal patterns of occupation, showing that early Australians had developed sophisticated scheduling systems that allowed them to maximise the productivity of coastal resources without overexploiting them. They move between different areas at different times of year, following natural cycles of abundance and scarcity. More importantly, the middens show evidence of feasting, large-scale communal meals that brought together people from different groups. These weren't just social gatherings, they were political and economic institutions that maintained the networks of cooperation and information sharing that made continental-scale society possible. The stone tools found in these sites tell another part of the story. Early Australian tool technologies were more sophisticated than anything found in other parts of the world at the same time. They were making composite tools, implements that combined different materials like stone, wood, and plant resins to create objects that were stronger and more versatile than any single material could provide. They were also making tools that required extraordinary skill and patience. Some of the finest examples of stone knapping ever discovered come from early Australian sites. These aren't crude implements hastily made for immediate use. They're precisely crafted objects that represent hours of careful work by skilled artisans. But perhaps the most remarkable evidence comes from the rock art sites scattered across the continent. Some of these paintings may be as old as 65,000 years, making them among the oldest known artistic works in the world. But they're not just pretty pictures. They're sophisticated information storage systems that preserved crucial knowledge about animals, plants, seasonal patterns, and cultural practices. The rock art sites weren't just galleries, they were libraries. Each painting was part of a larger narrative system that connected past, present, and future in ways that purely oral traditions couldn't achieve. They served as teaching aids, helping to transmit complex knowledge from one generation to the next. Some of the most sophisticated examples show what's called X-ray art, depicting animals with their internal organs visible. This wasn't just artistic creativity, it demonstrated detailed anatomical knowledge that could only have come from careful observation and systematic study. These early Australians weren't just artists, they were scientists, developing detailed understanding of the natural world through direct observation and experimentation. The sophistication of this knowledge system becomes even more apparent when we examine how it was transmitted across generations. Unlike written languages, which can be copied and stored independently of human memory, these oral and visual knowledge systems required constant renewal through teaching and practice. Yet somehow, crucial information was preserved with remarkable accuracy for tens of thousands of years. Stories that encoded practical knowledge about seasonal patterns, resource locations, and navigation routes were passed down through hundreds of generations without losing their essential content. Songs that served as maps, preserving the locations of water sources and safe camping areas across territories spanning hundreds of kilometres, maintained their accuracy across millennia. This wasn't just cultural preservation, it was technological achievement on a scale that challenges our understanding of what's possible without writing. They created information storage and retrieval systems that were more robust and longer lasting than most written records. While ancient civilizations rose and fell, leaving behind fragmented texts and ruined libraries, these oral knowledge systems continued functioning, adapting to changing conditions while maintaining their core content. The precision of these systems becomes apparent when we compare traditional Aboriginal accounts of landscape features with modern geological surveys. In case after case, oral traditions that describe the locations of underground water sources, seasonal flooding patterns, or the behaviour of specific animal populations turn out to be remarkably accurate when tested against scientific measurements. But these weren't just practical information systems. They were also deeply spiritual frameworks that connected people to the landscape in ways that went far beyond simple resource extraction. Early Australians developed complex belief systems that saw the land not as property to be owned, but as a living entity with which humans had reciprocal relationships. These spiritual systems weren't abstract philosophies divorced from daily life. They were practical frameworks that guided decision-making about everything from hunting and gathering to fire management and social relationships. They provided ethical guidelines for how to interact with the environment sustainably, ensuring that resources would be available for future generations. The power of these belief systems becomes apparent when we look at their environmental track record. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal Australians managed to support substantial populations across the entire continent without causing the kind of ecological collapse that has accompanied human expansion in so many other parts of the world. They achieved this through what we might recognise as the world's first continental ecosystem management system. Using controlled burning, selective harvesting, and coordinated resource management across vast areas, they maintained the health and productivity of natural systems while supporting human communities. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships, accumulated over thousands of years of careful observation and experimentation. They understood that human activities had consequences that rippled through entire ecosystems, and they developed management practices that worked with natural processes rather than against them. The scale of this achievement becomes clear when we consider what they were managing. Australia is a continent of extraordinary environmental diversity, from tropical rainforests to frozen alpine regions to some of the most arid deserts on Earth. Each of these environments required different management approaches, yet the overall system had to remain coherent enough to prevent conflicts between neighbouring groups. They solved this coordination problem through the development of what anthropologists call nested social systems. Local groups managed resources within their immediate territories, according to detailed knowledge of local conditions. Regional networks coordinated activities across larger areas to prevent conflicts and ensure that resources were shared during times of scarcity. Continental networks maintained the cultural and genetic connections that prevented the system from fragmenting into incompatible societies. The complexity of these social systems rivals anything achieved by state-level societies, yet they operated without the hierarchical institutions that most complex societies depend on. Instead of kings, bureaucrats, and armies, they relied on kinship relationships, reciprocal obligations, and shared cultural practices to maintain order across vast distances. This wasn't just an alternative form of social organisation, it was arguably a more sophisticated one. They created systems that were flexible enough to adapt to changing environmental conditions, robust enough to survive major disruptions, and sustainable enough to last for tens of thousands of years without institutional collapse. The evidence for this sophisticated social organisation appears in the archaeological record as patterns of artefact distribution, trade networks, and shared cultural practices that extend across the entire continent. Ochre from specific quarries appears in sites thousands of kilometres away. Stone tools made with particular techniques show up in regions far from where those techniques were developed. Artistic styles and symbolic systems spread across multiple climate zones and language groups. But perhaps the most impressive evidence comes from what didn't happen. Despite occupying a continent for tens of thousands of years, despite developing sophisticated technologies and complex social systems, early Australians never developed the kind of intensive agriculture, urban centres, or state institutions that characterised complex societies in other parts of the world. This wasn't because they were incapable of such developments. The archaeological record shows that they had all the necessary technological and social capabilities. They chose not to develop these systems because they had found better alternatives, ways of organising society that could support large populations and complex cultures without the environmental costs and social inequalities that accompanied agricultural civilizations elsewhere. They proved that human societies could be both complex and sustainable, both innovative and stable, both locally adapted and continentally connected. They created what may be the most successful human social experiment in history, a way of organising civilization that could last for tens of thousands of years without destroying the environmental systems that made it possible. Yet despite these remarkable achievements, the story of early Australians remains largely invisible in most accounts of human cultural evolution. Their technologies don't survive in museums. Their cities were never built. Their writing systems never existed. The evidence of their success is written in the landscape itself, in the ecosystems they helped create and maintain, in the cultural traditions that survived for millennia without institutional support. This invisibility isn't accidental. It reflects biases in how we define progress, success, and cultural achievement. We tend to measure human societies by their material accumulations, their monumental architecture, their written records. By these measures, early Australian societies appear simple, even primitive. But when we measure societies by their sustainability, their social cohesion, their ability to maintain cultural continuity across vast spans of time, early Australian societies emerge as possibly the most successful human civilizations ever created. They achieved something that no other society has managed. They created ways of being human that could last not for centuries, but for hundreds of centuries. Their success challenges our most basic assumptions about the trajectory of human development. We tend to think of cultural evolution as a linear process, with societies becoming more complex, more technologically sophisticated, more capable of controlling their environments over time. The early Australian example suggests that this trajectory isn't inevitable and may not even be desirable. Sometimes the most sophisticated response to environmental challenges isn't developing more powerful technologies or more complex institutions. Sometimes it's learning to live more simply, more sustainably, more in harmony with natural systems. Sometimes the greatest human achievement isn't conquering the environment, but learning to be part of it. The early Australians didn't just survive their impossible journey across the ocean to an unknown continent. They created something that may be unique in human history, a form of civilization that enhanced rather than degraded the natural systems it depended on. They proved that humans could be a creative force in natural ecosystems, not just a destructive one. Their genetic descendants are still there, still maintaining connections to country that stretch back through hundreds of generations. They've survived ice ages, sea level changes, climate shifts, and more recently, the devastating impacts of European colonization. Yet many of the cultural traditions, knowledge systems, and spiritual connections that sustained their ancestors for tens of thousands of years continue to this day. In our final segment, we'll explore how this ancient story connects to our modern world, what lessons these early Australian societies might offer for contemporary challenges, and why understanding their achievements might be crucial for our own species' long-term survival. We'll discover that the story of the first Australians isn't just ancient history, it's a blueprint for how human societies might organise themselves to thrive within planetary boundaries. The more we learn about these early Australian societies, the more we realise that they may have developed some of the most advanced social technologies in human history. Not advanced in the sense of complex machinery or powerful institutions, but advanced in the sense of creating sustainable, equitable, and resilient ways of organising human communities that could maintain themselves across geological timescales. Their achievement becomes even more remarkable when we consider the constraints they were working within. They had no domesticated animals, except the dingo, which arrived much later. They had no metal tools, no written language, no permanent architecture. Yet they created continental-scale societies that were more sustainable and arguably more successful than any civilization that followed. They did this by developing what we might call ecological intelligence, deep understanding of how human activities affected natural systems, and practical wisdom about how to live within environmental limits without exceeding them. This wasn't just technical knowledge, it was a fundamentally different way of thinking about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Instead of seeing themselves as separate from nature, destined to control and exploit it, they understood themselves as part of natural systems, with responsibilities to maintain the health and productivity of the ecosystems they depended on. This perspective shaped every aspect of their culture, from their spiritual beliefs to their economic practices to their social institutions. The result was a form of human organisation that enhanced ecological diversity rather than reducing it, that increased the productivity of natural systems rather than depleting them, that created cultural richness without environmental poverty. They proved that human societies could be forces for ecological creativity, not just ecological destruction. This understanding of ecological intelligence wasn't something they developed overnight. It emerged through tens of thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and refinement. Each generation added to the accumulated knowledge, testing new approaches, refining successful strategies, and passing on the lessons learned from both successes and failures. What makes this achievement even more extraordinary is that they developed these sophisticated systems while maintaining what anthropologists call cultural egalitarianism. Unlike most complex societies throughout history, early Australian communities never developed the kind of rigid social hierarchies that concentrated power in the hands of a few individuals or elite classes. Instead, they created what we might recognise as the world's first large-scale democratic societies. Decision-making was distributed across communities, with different individuals taking leadership roles based on their expertise in specific areas. Someone might lead during hunting expeditions, another during ceremonial gatherings, still another during negotiations with neighbouring groups. This distributed leadership wasn't just more equitable, it was also more effective. By drawing on the knowledge and skills of many individuals, rather than concentrating authority in a single leader, these societies could respond more flexibly to changing conditions and make better decisions about complex issues that affected entire communities. The sophistication of their decision-making processes becomes apparent when we examine how they managed resources across vast territories. They developed what modern economists would recognise as sophisticated resource allocation systems, but ones that operated according to principles of reciprocity and sustainability rather than individual accumulation and competitive advantage. These weren't simple barter economies, they were complex networks of mutual obligation that ensured resources flowed to where they were needed most, regardless of local abundance or scarcity. During times of plenty, communities that controlled rich resource areas shared their surplus with neighbours. During times of hardship, those same neighbours reciprocated, ensuring that no group faced starvation while others had abundance. But these systems weren't just about material resources. They also managed information, social connections, and cultural practices. Knowledge developed in one region was shared throughout the network. Innovations in tool making, fire management, or social organisation spread across the continent. Cultural practices like ceremonies, artistic styles, and storytelling traditions were maintained and transmitted across vast distances. This information management was crucial to their success. In a world without writing, the ability to preserve and transmit complex knowledge across generations required sophisticated systems of education and cultural reproduction. They developed what we might call living libraries, human communities that served as repositories of accumulated wisdom. These living libraries weren't just passive storage systems. They were dynamic, adaptive institutions that could update their knowledge base as conditions changed, incorporate new discoveries, and modify existing practices to meet new challenges. They represented a form of collective intelligence that was arguably more sophisticated than anything achieved by literate civilizations. The power of these systems becomes apparent when we consider their longevity. While written records from ancient civilizations often become corrupted, lost, or misinterpreted over time, these oral knowledge systems maintain their accuracy and usefulness across hundreds of generations. They proved that human communities could serve as more reliable repositories of information than books, libraries, or archives. But perhaps their greatest achievement was developing sustainable relationships with time itself. Most human societies operate on relatively short time horizons, making decisions based on their effects over years or decades at most. Early Australian societies developed what we might call deep time thinking, making decisions based on their consequences across centuries or millennia. This long-term perspective shaped every aspect of their culture. They developed harvesting practices that ensured resources would remain available for future generations. They created social institutions that could maintain stability across vast spans of time. They established spiritual frameworks that connected present actions to ancestral obligations and future responsibilities. This deep time perspective wasn't just philosophical, it was intensely practical. By thinking in terms of centuries rather than years, they could develop management strategies that maintained the long-term health of the ecosystems they depended on. They understood that what seemed like minor environmental changes could have major consequences if they accumulated over time. They also understood that cultural practices needed to be maintained across many generations to remain effective. The songs that served as navigational aids, the stories that preserved ecological knowledge, the ceremonies that reinforced social bonds, all had to be performed regularly to maintain their power and accuracy. This required what we might call cultural discipline, the collective commitment to maintaining practices and traditions even when their immediate benefits weren't obvious. It meant that each generation had to learn not just how to survive in their own time, but how to preserve the knowledge and practices that future generations would need. The result was a form of cultural continuity that has no parallel in human history. While other civilizations rose and fell, languages appeared and disappeared, and entire ways of life vanished without a trace. These Australian societies maintained their essential character across time spans that dwarf the entire history of written civilization. They created what we might call temporal resilience, the ability to maintain cultural coherence across geological timescales. This wasn't just about preserving traditions, it was about creating adaptive systems that could maintain their core functions while adjusting to changing environmental and social conditions. This temporal resilience required something that most modern societies lack: the ability to balance innovation with conservation. Early Australian societies were constantly adapting, developing new techniques, exploring new territories, and responding to changing conditions. But they did so within frameworks that preserved the essential knowledge and practices that had enabled their long-term success. They understood that not all change is progress, and that some innovations, no matter how appealing in the short term, could have destructive consequences over longer time periods. They developed cultural mechanisms for evaluating new ideas and practices, accepting those that enhanced long-term sustainability while rejecting those that threatened it. This selective approach to innovation allowed them to remain dynamic and creative, while avoiding the kind of runaway technological and social changes that destabilized other societies. They proved that it was possible to have progress without destruction, innovation without instability, growth without collapse. But perhaps their most profound achievement was developing what we might call ecological wisdom. Deep understanding not just of how natural systems worked, but of how human societies could fit within those systems without disrupting them. This wasn't just technical knowledge, it was a fundamentally different way of understanding the relationship between culture and nature. Instead of seeing human culture as something separate from or opposed to natural systems, they understood culture as part of nature, subject to the same principles and constraints that governed other living systems. This perspective led them to develop cultural practices that enhanced rather than degraded the ecological systems they were part of. They created what ecologists now recognize as positive feedback loops between human activities and environmental health. Their fire management practices increased the productivity of natural systems. Their harvesting techniques promoted the growth and reproduction of useful species. Their social practices maintained the genetic and cultural diversity that made their communities more resilient. This integration of human culture with natural systems created something unprecedented, a form of civilization that enhanced rather than diminished biological diversity. Instead of simplifying ecosystems to make them more useful to humans, they found ways to increase ecosystem complexity while still meeting human needs. They proved that the apparent conflict between human development and environmental protection is not inevitable. They showed that human societies can be forces for ecological creativity, not just ecological destruction. They demonstrated that the most sophisticated response to environmental challenges might not be developing more powerful technologies, but learning to work more skillfully within natural limits. Their example challenges our most basic assumptions about progress, development, and human potential. It suggests that the trajectory of increasing technological complexity and environmental impact that has characterized recent human history is not the only possible path. It shows that human societies can choose different directions, ones that lead toward greater sustainability rather than greater power. But their story also reminds us that such achievements don't happen automatically. They require conscious choice, collective commitment, and cultural discipline maintained across many generations. They require societies that can think beyond immediate needs and short-term benefits to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. Most importantly, they require recognition that human societies are not separate from natural systems, but part of them. The early Australians succeeded because they understood this fundamental truth and organised their entire civilization around it. They created not just sustainable societies, but regenerative ones, communities that left the world richer and more diverse than they found it. As we face our own environmental challenges, as we struggle with questions of sustainability and long-term survival, the example of these early Australian societies offers both inspiration and instruction. They prove that different kinds of human civilization are possible, ones that enhance rather than degrade the natural systems they depend on. Their story suggests that the solutions to our current challenges might not require new technologies or more powerful institutions, but rather different ways of thinking about our relationship with the natural world. Perhaps what we need is not more control over nature, but better understanding of how to be part of it. The first humans who crossed that impossible ocean to reach an unknown continent didn't just survive their journey. They created something unprecedented in human history, a way of being human that could last not for decades or centuries, but for hundreds of centuries. They proved that our species is capable of achievements we're only beginning to understand, achievements that might hold the keys to our own long-term survival. Their legacy lives on, not just in the genes of their descendants, but in the landscapes they helped shape, the knowledge systems they created, and the example they set for what human societies can accomplish when they learn to work with, rather than against, the natural world. In a time when our own civilization faces unprecedented challenges, their story offers both hope and guidance for creating a more sustainable future. The ocean they crossed was vast and dangerous, but the world they created on the other side was even more remarkable. It stands as testament to human ingenuity, adaptability and wisdom, proof that our species can create forms of civilization that enhance, rather than diminish, the living systems that sustain all life on Earth. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this ancient Australian achievement isn't what we can measure or quantify, it's what we've lost. Because when European colonisation began in 1788, it didn't just disrupt existing societies, it severed connections to knowledge systems that had been maintained for over 60,000 years. Imagine libraries burning, but these weren't buildings filled with books. These were living repositories of information carried in human memory, encoded in ceremony, embedded in the landscape itself. When languages disappeared, when elders died without passing on their knowledge, when sacred sites were destroyed or access to them was blocked, millennia of accumulated wisdom vanished. This wasn't just cultural loss, it was the destruction of practical knowledge that we're only now beginning to understand the value of. Traditional fire management techniques that prevented catastrophic wildfires, sustainable harvesting practices that maintained ecosystem health, navigation systems that could guide people across vast distances without instruments, medical knowledge derived from tens of thousands of years of observation and experimentation. Modern Australia is still grappling with the consequences of this knowledge loss. As climate change makes the continent more fire-prone, land managers are turning to traditional Aboriginal burning practices. As scientists search for new medicines, they're discovering that Indigenous knowledge systems identified therapeutic compounds that Western science is only now learning to synthesize. But the loss goes deeper than practical knowledge. It represents the severing of one of the longest continuous human relationships with a landscape anywhere on Earth. For more than 60,000 years, Aboriginal Australians had been engaged in an ongoing conversation with their environment, learning its rhythms, responding to its changes, becoming part of its natural cycles. That conversation had produced something unprecedented, a form of human culture that enhanced rather than degraded the natural systems it was part of. The Australia that Europeans encountered in 1788 was not wilderness. It was a carefully managed landscape, shaped by thousands of generations of human activity that had increased rather than decreased its biological diversity. The eucalyptus forests, with their distinctive open understory, the grasslands that supported such abundant wildlife, the complex mosaic of different vegetation types that created habitat for hundreds of species. Much of what Europeans saw as natural landscape was actually the product of sophisticated human management. When that management stopped, when the knowledge systems that guided it were disrupted, the landscape itself began to change. Fire regimes shifted, becoming more intense and less predictable. Some plant species became more dominant while others disappeared. Animal populations fluctuated as their habitat relationships were disrupted. We're still living with the consequences of that disruption. The catastrophic wildfires that now regularly sweep across Australia are partly the result of the breakdown of traditional fire management systems. The loss of biodiversity in many regions reflects the absence of the careful stewardship that had maintained ecological balance for millennia. But something remarkable has been happening in recent decades. Despite centuries of disruption, despite policies designed to eliminate Aboriginal culture, despite the massive social and environmental changes that have transformed the continent, some of those ancient knowledge systems have survived. In remote communities across Australia, elders still carry songs that map the landscape, stories that encode ecological knowledge, ceremonies that maintain connections to country. Languages that were declared extinct have been revived by determined communities working with linguists and anthropologists. Traditional practices that were forbidden for generations are being quietly resumed. This cultural renaissance isn't just about preserving the past, it's about applying ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. Aboriginal communities are leading efforts to restore degraded landscapes using traditional methods. They're working with scientists to develop new approaches to conservation that combine Indigenous knowledge with modern techniques. Universities are establishing programs that bring together Aboriginal elders and academic researchers. Land management agencies are hiring Indigenous rangers to apply traditional fire management techniques. Medical researchers are collaborating with traditional healers to investigate the therapeutic properties of native plants. But perhaps most importantly, there's growing recognition that the knowledge systems developed by early Australians represent more than just interesting historical curiosities. They represent alternative ways of organising human relationships with the natural world, ways that might be crucial for addressing the environmental challenges facing our entire planet. The climate crisis, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse that threaten modern civilization are all symptoms of the same fundamental problem. Human societies that treat the natural world as an external resource to be exploited rather than a living system to be part of. The early Australians solved this problem. They created ways of being human that enhanced rather than degraded the ecological systems they depended on. Their solutions weren't based on advanced technology or complex institutions. They were based on deep ecological knowledge, long-term thinking, and cultural practices that maintain sustainable relationships between human communities and natural systems. These are exactly the capabilities that modern societies need to develop if we're going to create a sustainable future. The story of the first Australians isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for how human societies might organise themselves to thrive within planetary boundaries. It shows that the apparent conflict between human development and environmental protection is not inevitable. It proves that human societies can be forces for ecological creativity rather than ecological destruction. But their example also reminds us that such achievements don't happen automatically. They require conscious choice, collective commitment, and cultural practices maintained across many generations. They require societies that can think beyond immediate needs to consider the long-term consequences of their actions. Most importantly, they require recognition that human societies are not separate from natural systems, but part of them. The early Australians succeeded because they understood this fundamental truth and organised their entire civilization around it. As we face our own impossible crossings, our own uncharted territories, our own challenges that seem beyond human capability, the story of those first ocean voyagers offers both inspiration and instruction. They faced the unknown with nothing but stone tools, fire, and the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. Yet they didn't just survive. They created something extraordinary. They proved that human beings are capable of achievements we're only beginning to understand. That our species possesses capabilities for adaptation, cooperation, and long-term thinking that exceed what we usually imagine possible. That the combination of intelligence, creativity, and social cooperation that defines humanity is even more powerful than we typically recognise. But they also proved that these capabilities must be consciously cultivated and carefully maintained. The wisdom they developed wasn't automatic or inevitable. It emerged through thousands of years of careful observation, experimentation, and refinement. Each generation had to learn not just how to survive, but how to preserve and transmit the knowledge that future generations would need. The ocean they crossed was vast and dangerous, but the achievement they created on the other side was even more remarkable. They built not monuments that would crumble, but relationships that would endure. They created not empires that would fall, but knowledge systems that could last for geological ages. Their legacy reminds us that the greatest human achievements aren't always the most visible ones. Sometimes the most profound accomplishments are the quietest ones. Learning to live sustainably, maintaining cultural continuity across vast spans of time, creating societies that enhance rather than degrade the natural world. As we stand at our own threshold, facing challenges that will determine the future of our species and our planet, we might remember those ancient voyagers who looked across an impossible stretch of water and decided to cross it anyway. They had no guarantee of success, no certainty about what lay on the other side, no assurance that their journey would lead anywhere at all. But they had something else, the courage to venture into the unknown, the wisdom to learn from their environment, and the commitment to create something better for future generations. They turned an alien continent into a home that could last for hundreds of centuries. The ocean between us and a sustainable future may seem just as vast and dangerous as the one those first Australians crossed. But their story proves that impossible journeys can be completed, that unknown territories can become home, and that human beings are capable of creating ways of life that can endure across geological time. We are the descendants of ocean crossers, of continent makers, of people who looked at impossible challenges and found ways to overcome them. The blood of those ancient voyagers flows in all of us, carrying with it the memory of courage, adaptability, and hope that made their extraordinary journey possible. The question now is whether we have the wisdom to learn from their example, the courage to make our own impossible crossing, and the commitment to create something on the other side that will be worthy of the journey. The ocean is vast, the destination uncertain, but the voyage has already begun. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the simple act of setting sail, of choosing hope over fear, of deciding to believe that better worlds are possible, is what transforms impossible journeys into extraordinary achievements. The first Australians didn't know they were making history. They were just trying to make a future. That's what we're doing too. And their story reminds us that even the most impossible crossings, undertaken with nothing but courage and wisdom, can lead to shores we never imagined possible. Thank you for joining me on this journey across deep time, bored people. If this exploration of humanity's most extraordinary ocean crossing helped you see our species' capabilities in a new light, or just gave you something meaningful to think about while the world spins its chaotic dance outside, consider subscribing to Muted History. It helps more people discover these longer explorations of what makes us human. Let me know in the comments how you experience this story. Are you listening while falling asleep, working through a quiet evening, or somewhere else entirely? The algorithm doesn't care, but I do. Until next time, remember that we are all descendants of impossible journeys, carriers of ancient courage, and proof that the most challenging crossings often lead to the most extraordinary destinations. Stay curious, stay questioning, and remember that the most profound achievements in human history often leave the quietest traces. The first Australians didn't build pyramids or write epic poems, but they accomplished something far more extraordinary. They created a way of being human that could endure for geological ages. The evidence for this remarkable achievement comes from the most unlikely sources, not from grand monuments or golden artifacts, but from microscopic pollen grains trapped in ancient sediments, from chemical signatures in thousand-year-old charcoal, from patterns of wear on stone tools so subtle that only experts can read them. When scientists first began analysing these traces, they expected to find the usual story of human expansion. Arrival, environmental disruption, species extinctions, and the familiar pattern of ecological collapse that has accompanied human colonisation in so many other parts of the world. Instead, they found something unprecedented. The Australian environment didn't collapse after human arrival. In many regions, it actually became more diverse, more productive, more resilient. The forests grew more complex, the grasslands supported more species, the fire regimes became more stable and predictable. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate management strategies that took thousands of years to develop and refine. The early Australians weren't just adapting to their environment, they were actively improving it, using fire, selective harvesting, and landscape modification to create ecosystems that were more productive and diverse than what had existed before human arrival. The sophistication of these management systems becomes apparent when we examine the pollen records from ancient lake beds. These microscopic time capsules show us exactly which plants were growing in different regions at different times, and how those plant communities changed after human arrival. In region after region, the pattern is the same. After an initial period of adjustment, plant diversity increases. Fire-adapted species become more common, but they don't dominate. Instead, they form part of complex mosaics that include fire-sensitive species in protected areas, creating landscape-scale diversity that supports a broader range of animals and ecological processes. This wasn't random, it was the result of sophisticated burning strategies that created patchworks of different aged vegetation across vast areas. Some patches were burned frequently to maintain grasslands and open woodlands. Others were protected from fire to preserve fire-sensitive species and provide refuge areas. Still others were burned on longer cycles to maintain different types of forest structure. The precision of this fire management is revealed in the charcoal layers preserved in lake sediments. Instead of the chaotic patterns we might expect from random wildfires, these layers show regular, controlled burning cycles that varied by region and vegetation type. The early Australians had essentially created continental-scale fire management systems that operated for tens of thousands of years. But fire was just one tool in a much larger toolkit. They also used selective harvesting to promote useful species, landscape modification to create productive habitats, and sophisticated scheduling systems to prevent overexploitation of resources. The evidence for these practices comes partly from what didn't happen. Unlike in other parts of the world where human arrival was followed by massive extinctions of large mammals, Australia's megafauna extinctions were more gradual and selective. Some species disappeared relatively quickly after human arrival, but others persisted for thousands of years, suggesting that early Australians developed hunting practices that allowed sustainable coexistence with at least some of the giant animals. More telling is what's happened to the smaller animals and plants. Instead of the simplification and homogenization that typically accompanies human expansion, Australia's ecosystems became more complex and diverse. This suggests that early Australians were not just taking from their environment, but actively managing it to increase its productivity and resilience. The archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Stone tools become more sophisticated over time, but they also become more diverse. Instead of developing a few highly efficient tool types that could be used everywhere, early Australians created region-specific toolkits adapted to local conditions and resources. This regional specialisation extended to every aspect of their culture. Different areas developed distinct artistic styles, different approaches to social organisation, different seasonal cycles and resource management strategies. Yet these regional variations were connected by trade networks, intermarriage, and shared cultural practices that maintained continental-scale coherence. The result was something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that was both locally adapted and globally connected, both environmentally sustainable and culturally dynamic. They proved that human societies could increase in complexity and sophistication without destroying the ecological systems that supported them. But perhaps their greatest achievement was temporal. They created cultural systems that could maintain their essential functions across timescales that dwarf the entire history of written civilization. While empires rose and fell, languages appeared and disappeared, and entire ways of life vanished without trace. These Australian societies maintained their core practices and knowledge systems across hundreds of generations. This temporal stability wasn't the result of rigid conservatism or resistance to change. Archaeological evidence shows continuous innovation in tools, techniques, and cultural practices throughout their long history. But these innovations were integrated into existing frameworks in ways that enhanced rather than disrupted the overall system. They developed what we might call adaptive traditionalism, the ability to maintain essential knowledge and practices while continuously adjusting to changing conditions. This required sophisticated mechanisms for evaluating new ideas, accepting those that enhanced long-term sustainability while rejecting those that threatened it. The precision of these evaluation systems becomes apparent when we examine how they responded to major environmental changes. During the last ice age, when sea levels dropped and the climate became more arid, they adjusted their fire management practices, modified their seasonal movements, and developed new technologies for water conservation. But they did so within existing cultural frameworks, maintaining the essential knowledge systems that had enabled their success. When the Ice Age ended and sea levels rose, flooding vast areas of coastal plain and severing the land bridge to New Guinea, they again adapted their practices without losing their cultural continuity. The archaeological record shows remarkable stability in core cultural elements, even as surface practices evolved to meet new conditions. This combination of stability and adaptability allowed them to survive environmental changes that disrupted societies throughout the rest of the world. They weathered ice ages, volcanic eruptions, climate shifts, and sea level changes while maintaining the essential knowledge and practices that defined their civilization. The genetic evidence confirms this cultural continuity. Despite occupying a continent for over 60,000 years, despite adapting to environments ranging from tropical rainforests to frozen mountains, modern Aboriginal Australians show clear genetic connections to those first ocean-crossing voyagers. There was no replacement, no major population turnover, just continuous adaptation within a stable framework. But genetics tells only part of the story. The real evidence for their achievement lies in the landscapes themselves, in ecosystems that still bear the imprint of tens of thousands of years of careful management, in species assemblages that were shaped by human activities so subtle that we're only now learning to recognise them. Modern ecologists studying Australian environments are discovering that many ecosystems they thought were natural were actually the products of sophisticated human management. The distinctive structure of eucalyptus forests, the species composition of grasslands, even the distribution of many plant and animal species reflect thousands of years of indigenous management practices. When European colonisation disrupted these management systems, the effects rippled through entire ecosystems. Fire regimes became more chaotic. Some species became overabundant while others disappeared. Landscapes that had been stable for millennia began changing in ways that are still unfolding today. This ecological disruption was matched by cultural devastation. Languages that had been spoken for tens of thousands of years disappeared within generations. Knowledge systems that had taken millennia to develop were lost as elders died without being able to pass on their wisdom. Sacred sites that served as libraries and universities were destroyed or made inaccessible. The scale of this loss is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine if every library, university, and research institution in the modern world vanished simultaneously. That begins to approximate what happened to Aboriginal knowledge systems during the colonial period. Millennia of accumulated wisdom about sustainable living, ecological management, and social organisation disappeared in the space of a few generations. Yet something extraordinary has been happening in recent decades. Despite centuries of disruption, despite deliberate policies aimed at cultural destruction, some of those ancient knowledge systems have survived. In remote communities across Australia, elders still carry fragments of the old wisdom. Languages declared extinct have been revived. Traditional practices banned for generations are being quietly resumed. This cultural renaissance isn't just about preserving the past. It's about applying ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. Aboriginal communities are leading efforts to restore fire management practices that reduce wildfire risk. They're working with scientists to develop conservation strategies that combine traditional knowledge with modern techniques. They're demonstrating that some of the oldest human knowledge systems, may also be the most relevant for addressing current environmental crises. The irony is profound. The same knowledge systems that were dismissed as primitive by colonial authorities are now being recognised as sophisticated solutions to problems that modern society struggles to solve. Traditional fire management techniques that were banned as dangerous are now being adopted by government agencies as essential tools for wildfire prevention. Indigenous conservation practices that were disrupted by European land use are now being restored as the most effective methods for maintaining biodiversity. But the Renaissance goes deeper than practical applications. There's growing recognition that the worldview that underlies these practices represents a fundamentally different way of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world. Instead of seeing nature as a resource to be exploited, traditional Aboriginal cultures understood humans as part of natural systems, with responsibilities to maintain the health of the whole. This perspective is increasingly relevant as modern society grapples with climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse. The environmental crises facing our planet are symptoms of the same fundamental problem that early Australians solved tens of thousands of years ago: how to organise human societies that enhance rather than degrade the natural systems they depend on. Their solutions weren't based on advanced technology or complex institutions. They were based on deep ecological knowledge, long-term thinking, and cultural practices that maintain sustainable relationships between human communities and natural systems. These are exactly the capabilities that modern societies need to develop if they're going to create a sustainable future. The story of the first Australians offers both hope and instruction. It proves that human societies can be forces for ecological creativity rather than destruction. It shows that the apparent conflict between human development and environmental protection is not inevitable. It demonstrates that our species is capable of achievements that we're only beginning to understand. But their example also reminds us that such achievements require conscious choice, collective commitment, and cultural practices maintained across many generations. They require societies that can think beyond immediate needs to consider long-term consequences. Most importantly, they require recognition that human societies are not separate from natural systems, but part of them. As we face our own environmental challenges, as we search for ways to create a sustainable future, the wisdom of those first ocean crossers becomes increasingly relevant. They faced impossible odds with primitive technology, yet created something that lasted for geological ages. They proved that human ingenuity, when guided by ecological wisdom and long-term thinking, can create ways of life that enhance rather than diminish the living world. The ocean they crossed was vast and dangerous, but the civilization they built on the other side was even more remarkable. It stands as proof that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievements when they learn to work with, rather than against, the natural world. Their legacy reminds us that the greatest human accomplishments aren't always the most visible ones, and that the most profound wisdom often comes from the quietest voices. In our next segment, we'll explore how this ancient story connects to our modern world, what lessons these early Australian societies might offer for contemporary challenges, and why understanding their achievements might be crucial for our own species' long-term survival. We'll discover that the story of the first Australians isn't just ancient history. It may be a roadmap for navigating the challenges that lie ahead. But for now, we leave those ancient voyagers where we found them, standing on impossible shores they had made into home. Guardians of wisdom we're only beginning to understand, proof that the most challenging crossings often lead to the most extraordinary destinations. Today, we stand at the end of one story and the beginning of another. The first humans who crossed that impossible ocean to reach Australia didn't just complete a journey, they began an experiment in human possibility that would run for over 60,000 years, testing whether our species could create ways of living that enhanced rather than diminished the world around them. The results of that experiment are still being written today in the landscapes they shaped, in the knowledge systems some of their descendants still carry, and in the lessons their achievements offer for our own uncertain future. When we measure human success, we tend to look for the obvious markers: cities that touch the sky, empires that spanned continents, technologies that bent the physical world to human will. By these standards, the first Australians might seem like a footnote in human history, people who arrived early but never built anything that would impress a tourist or fill a museum. But what if we measured success differently? What if we asked not how much a civilization could accumulate, but how long it could endure? Not how completely it could dominate its environment, but how skillfully it could integrate with it. Not how fast it could grow, but how sustainably it could maintain itself. By these measures, the first Australians created perhaps the most successful civilization in human history. They developed social technologies that maintained themselves across more than 2,000 generations. They created knowledge systems more durable than any library. They built relationships with their environment that enhanced rather than depleted the living systems around them. And they did all of this while maintaining what we might recognise as fundamentally human values: creativity, curiosity, social connection, spiritual meaning, and care for future generations. They proved that human societies could be both sophisticated and sustainable, both innovative and stable, both locally grounded and continentally connected. But perhaps their greatest achievement was proving that different kinds of human civilization were possible. The trajectory of increasing complexity, resource consumption, and environmental impact that has characterized recent human history was not inevitable. There were other paths, other ways of organizing human societies that led toward greater sustainability rather than greater power. This matters now more than ever, as our own civilization faces unprecedented environmental challenges. As we grapple with climate change, biodiversity loss, and ecosystem collapse, the example of the first Australians becomes increasingly relevant. They faced their own impossible challenges and found ways to overcome them that made the world richer rather than poorer. Their solutions weren't based on technological dominance or institutional control. They were based on ecological wisdom, long-term thinking, and cultural practices that maintained reciprocal relationships between human communities and natural systems. These are exactly the capabilities that modern societies need to develop if we're going to create a sustainable future. The knowledge systems they developed are still being rediscovered today. Traditional fire management practices that prevented catastrophic wildfires, sustainable harvesting techniques that maintained ecosystem health across millennia, navigation systems that could guide people across vast distances using nothing but careful observation of natural patterns. Modern scientists are finding that these traditional practices often work better than contemporary alternatives. Indigenous fire management reduces wildfire risk more effectively than mechanical fuel reduction. Traditional medicine derived from native plants often proves more effective than synthetic alternatives. Aboriginal conservation practices maintain biodiversity better than many modern protected area strategies. But the significance goes beyond practical applications. The worldview that underlies these practices represents a fundamentally different way of understanding human relationships with the natural world. Instead of seeing humans as separate from nature, destined to control and exploit it, traditional Aboriginal cultures understood humans as part of natural systems, with responsibilities to maintain the health of the whole. This perspective offers crucial insights for addressing contemporary environmental crises. The problems we face aren't just technical challenges that can be solved with better technology or more efficient institutions. They're symptoms of a deeper issue: human societies organised around principles that treat the natural world as an external resource rather than a living system we're part of. The first Australians solved this fundamental problem. They created ways of being human that enhanced rather than degraded the ecological systems they depended on. Their example proves that such solutions are possible, that human societies can be forces for ecological creativity rather than destruction. But their story also reminds us that these achievements didn't happen automatically. They required conscious choice, collective commitment, and cultural practices maintained across many generations. They required societies capable of thinking beyond immediate needs to consider long-term consequences. Most importantly, they required recognition that human well-being and environmental health were not competing priorities, but interconnected aspects of the same challenge. The early Australians succeeded because they understood this fundamental truth and organised their entire civilization around it. As we face our own environmental challenges, their example offers both inspiration and instruction. They prove that human beings are capable of extraordinary achievements when guided by ecological wisdom and long-term thinking. They show that the most profound human accomplishments often involve learning to work with natural systems rather than against them. But their legacy also carries a warning. The knowledge systems they developed over tens of thousands of years could be lost in just a few generations. The landscapes they carefully managed for millennia could be degraded by a few decades of inappropriate use. The social technologies they created for maintaining sustainable relationships could disappear if we don't make conscious efforts to understand and preserve them. The ocean those first voyagers crossed was vast and dangerous, but they didn't cross it to escape from the world. They crossed it to find new ways of being part of it. They turned an alien continent into a home that could endure for geological ages, not by conquering it, but by learning to belong to it. Their achievement reminds us that the greatest human stories aren't always about individual heroes or dramatic conquests. Sometimes they're about communities that learn to live so skillfully within natural systems that they enhance the world's capacity to sustain life itself. The descendants of those first ocean crossers are still there, still maintaining connections to country that stretch back through hundreds of generations. They've survived ice ages, climate changes, and the devastating impacts of colonization. Yet many of the cultural traditions, knowledge systems, and spiritual connections that sustained their ancestors for tens of thousands of years continue today. Their persistence offers hope that the wisdom developed over such vast spans of time hasn't been entirely lost. In remote communities across Australia, elders still carry fragments of ancient knowledge. Languages declared extinct are being revived. Traditional practices are being restored. The conversation between human culture and natural systems that was interrupted by colonization is slowly resuming. This cultural renaissance isn't just about preserving the past, it's about applying ancient wisdom to contemporary challenges. It's about recognizing that some of the oldest human knowledge systems may also be the most relevant for creating a sustainable future. The first Australians didn't just survive their impossible ocean crossing, they created something that transcended survival, a way of being human that could last for hundreds of centuries while making the world more beautiful, more diverse, more alive. They proved that our species possesses capabilities for wisdom, cooperation, and long-term thinking that we're only beginning to understand. As we stand at our own threshold, facing challenges that will determine the future of our planet and our species, their story reminds us that impossible crossings can be completed, that unknown territories can become home, and that human beings are capable of creating ways of life that enhance rather than diminish the living systems that sustain us all. The ocean between us and a sustainable future may seem as vast and dangerous as the one those first Australians crossed 65,000 years ago, but their story proves that with courage, wisdom, and commitment to something larger than ourselves, even the most impossible journeys can lead to extraordinary destinations. We are all descendants of ocean crossers, of people who looked at insurmountable challenges and found ways to transform them into opportunities for growth. The memory of that ancient courage flows in our blood, carrying with it the knowledge that better worlds are not just possible, but achievable. The question now is whether we have the wisdom to learn from their example, the courage to make our own impossible crossing, and the commitment to create something on the other side worthy of the journey. The tide is turning, the horizon beckons, and somewhere in the distance, new shores await. Thanks for sailing these deep currents with me, bored people. If this journey across 65,000 years of human achievement gave you something to think about, or just provided some calm company while the modern world churns outside your window, consider subscribing to Muted History. It helps these longer explorations find their way to other curious minds searching for something more substantial than the usual digital noise. Let me know in the comments where this story found you. Late night insomnia, quiet work session, long commute through landscapes those first Australians would recognise. I'm genuinely curious about the contexts where these deep time stories land. Until next time, remember that we carry within us the genetic memory of impossible journeys successfully completed, of unknown continents transformed into homes, of civilizations that learn to enhance rather than exploit the living world around them. That memory is still there, waiting to guide us toward our own extraordinary destinations. Stay thoughtful, stay questioning, and remember that the most profound human achievements often leave the quietest footprints. The first Australians didn't build monuments to their own glory, but they accomplished something far more remarkable. They created a way of being human that made the world more capable of sustaining life itself. The ocean they crossed has long since changed its boundaries, but the shores they reached are still there, still holding the memory of what human wisdom can accomplish when it learns to work with rather than against the natural world. In our own age of rising seas and impossible challenges, that memory might be exactly what we need to find our way home.